Hello, everyone. It is me, Sherrard Crespo. For those of you who don't know me, I am part of our clinical staff here at ViaLink and LCSW, and I am our Vice President of External Affairs and Executive Director of Prevent Child Abuse Louisiana. Y'all all received all of my emails begging you for the Wear Blue Day shirt pictures. I'm tongue-tied on that, but thank y'all so much for everybody who was able to help support us in that endeavor. And thank you to everybody for all that you do for ViaLink. And that is what we are going to be talking about today. Working at ViaLink, I'll speak for myself at least, I do think is such a privilege and such a rewarding job, but it comes with very real stress, which makes the very real need for self-care even more important. I heard this on a podcast. It was not like a mental health podcast. It was Lala from Vanderpump Rules podcast. But she said that it shouldn't even be called self-care. It should be called self-maintenance. And I totally agree with that. Because what we're going to talk about today is that making time for intentional self-care to cope through stress, cope through emotions is not indulgent. It is in fact a biological need for our brains to prevent and or heal from burnout, compassion fatigue, crisis, which are just things that happen when we are stressed and we do not have the time for that intentional good self-care that brings balance to our brain. So without further ado, I am going to get into my PowerPoint here that we're going to go through. And we're also even going to go through a few different exercises towards the end on some things that you can do to kind of help bring balance to the stress release in your brain. I'll do my best to demonstrate them on Zoom, but maybe even when we get to that section, Chercole, if you'd want to pause it and we can practice together. Again, thank you for allowing me to join y'all from a distance and asynchronously. I wish I could be with y'all in person. But getting into it, burnout. Burnout is very real. And I am going to stress this a lot because I think it is important to note that you can absolutely love your job, be so passionate about it, have so much compassion, which I know everybody here does, and still get burned out. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with your own boundaries, nothing to do with how great you are at your job, nothing about how much you love your job. We are human beings and we will succumb to stress, and stress can bring about burnout. And it's important that we give ourselves the permission to know when we might be building towards burnout or if we've hit that state of burnout so that we can say, I need a pause and I need to rebalance myself. I need to recalibrate my brain. I need to take some time for self-care so that I can keep on going on to help others. The oxygen mask metaphor is very real in airplanes where they say you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before you can put one on someone else. If you don't put yours on first, you will pass out and you will not be able to put an oxygen mask on anybody else. If you are not tending to your own self-care, if you're not giving yourself time to heal from your own burnout, you cannot help others. It's why I tell people that self-care is not only just something we should do for ourselves. I think in a health giving profession, it is an ethical obligation so that we can go on to continue to give the best care to the people that we serve. So there's super an amount of importance in knowing your limits, setting boundaries, and having intentional self-care. Self-care does not just take care of itself. So we're going to be reviewing some things, the development into a crisis state, contact center staff. I know you will know this very well, but we're going to put this into the context of what that means for things like burnout, what those effects on your brain are, what self-care really is and how to be intentional with your self-care and reaching out for help. And that slide there on resources, we will not need to review because we are the resources, but talking about yourself collaboratively and what are your internal resources is what we will be looking at. So stress is very real. And in this day and age, human beings are living under even more constant stress than our ancestors were before. Because of the day and age of technology that we live in, we don't have natural compartmentalization throughout our day like generations before did. So basically, we can just have a jumble of all the stress all the time going on in our brain. And studies are really showing that human beings are experiencing burnout and states of crisis more than generations ever were before. Even though if we're thinking about crisis states, and that's our fight or flight response, as is our burnout, that we live with less physical danger to our bodies than human beings ever did before. And a lot of that does have to do with things like news cycles and social media. And again, just constant access to every type of stress that you have. I'm holding my phone up. So, constant stress without that time for self care is going to alter your neocortical functioning and is going to cause your brain to begin to function in the crisis state. That crisis state is what our burnout is. It's kind of a freeze response or flight response. So, again, this reminder, you can absolutely love your job and still be under stress. So, what I want to talk about just briefly is what is this stress? Because there is good stress. We're talking stress, we're talking cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone, stress neurotransmitter in our brain. Cortisol, kind of a buzz topic right now. Cortisol in and of itself is not bad. There is tolerable stress and even positive stress. Positive stress from cortisol can be things like when you wake up in the morning, from your cup of coffee, from exercise, just a brief blip of that cortisol release that kind of gives you a little extra oomph. Tolerable stress, meaning that you are having something that's more of a negative stress, like how we think of stressors, but it's being counterbalanced with resiliency factors like support systems, and you get a natural balance to that stress release. Our brain craves balance. When cortisol is being released, it's the predominant neurotransmitter. It craves to have a feel good neurotransmitter. Oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, pick your point. What is the other one? Endorphins, pick whichever one, but your brain is craving a feel good neurotransmitter to bring balance. Because if we are to get to the point, which is toxic stress, that is what puts the brain into fight or flight mode. And toxic stress is very literal. Toxic stress, as we'll review, actually causes a diminution in blood volume in a part of your brain. And that's what causes that activation of fight or flight mode, even though there's not a physical danger to your body. So toxic stress is a prolonged cortisol release. We're only supposed to have a dominant cortisol release for about 20 minutes. So prolonged cortisol release without the opportunity for a balance of a feel-good neurotransmitter. Your brain will then crave a balancing neurotransmitter as if it is life dependent. So that is why intentional self-care is so important to balance your cortisol, because we can get really quick hits of things that give you feel-good neurotransmitters that are not very healthy for us. Things like junk food, alcohol, substance use, smoking, those types of things. And look, there is no shame to utilizing any of these things. But what we want to remember, let's just say if you're someone where you've had a really stressful day and you have a glass of wine and that helps you relax, there is no shame in that. But what you want to remember is that that glass of wine is not actually bringing balance to your brain. So you just want to be sure that you're making sure that that evening or the next day, you're going to do something that's going to bring some actual slow term balance to your brain. Because what can happen when we only depend on these quick hit feel good neurotransmitters, again, like smoking, alcohol, junk food, etc., is that you get a big spike of dopamine, serotonin, whatever it might be, and then you get a big depletion. Where the things like intentional self-care, mindfulness, movement, breathing, experiencing your emotions. So they're not as much of a quick hit. They're what bring natural balance to your neurotransmitters, and they don't create this sort of neurological like spike in depletion. They're going to actually give balance to your brain and help heal you from burnout or prevent burnout from happening. So going into crisis theory, again, I know this is information the contact center staff will know, but let's put this in the context of burnout. So when we're talking crisis, when we're talking this state of burnout, there is no metric to determine what type of stress, what type of life events are big enough to kind of flip that switch and put your brain into this fight or flight mode. In crisis theory, the event that does put you into crisis or burnout is just called the precipitating event. Precipitating means comes right before, because it's not about what happened, it's about what's been leading up to that moment where the switch flips and you go into crisis mode. So, as I said before, we all have stressors, all different types of stress levels every day of our lives, good, bad, and in between. Stress does not always mean negative stress. Stress, when we're talking about burnout and our brain function, essentially just means anything that elicits an emotional response from your brain. So, when we are functioning the way that we want to be, when we are giving our brain the balance and the rest that it needs, the way that it works is that something happens throughout the day and we have an emotion about it. That can be happiness, anxiousness, sadness, calm, fear, depression, whatever it might be. So something happens throughout the day that causes down in our subcortical limbic system, the part of our brain we do not control, to experience an emotional response. That emotional response is then communicated to the more forward-thinking part of your brain, and the cognitive part of your brain subconsciously and consciously chooses coping mechanisms to bring balance to the brain. So that can be our intentional self-care, things like getting exercise a few times a week, taking a long hot bath or shower, eating some healthy food. That's also things that we kind of do subconsciously. Like, let's say if you're having a tense moment with a coworker and you can start to feel that maybe your brain's telling you you're feeling angry. And so you say, let's take a pause, and you kind of take a minute to, that right there is the full cycle of like very positive emotional coping. You recognize the emotion that you are experiencing and you took a moment to cope through it. And that sort of physical action of shaking it out, of exhaling, that actually sends balancing signals to your brain that it doesn't need that predominant stress hormone release. So wonderful. What happens when we're building towards that burnout state, towards that crisis state? And again, we have all been there and we will all be there again at some point. So there's no shame in this, is that life gets busy and we don't have as much time or as much energy for those like intentional self-care activities that we do throughout the week. You know, maybe your sleep is getting dysregulated. Maybe you don't have time to cook some healthy meals. So you're having to grab more junk food or fast food. Maybe you don't have time on the weekend to like grab that cup of coffee with your friend and kind of debrief about your week, or have that phone call with that friend or family member where you know that you can vent it all out. You don't have time to take that walk or to go to the gym. You know, those kind of like things that we purposefully instill for health and wellness, you start to drop. And again, we've all been there. There's no shame in that. What that starts to do is it starts to put extra stress on your brain. You're getting inch by inch kind of an extra level of that cortisol release. As that continues to go, your brain is going to start to become overwhelmed. That's actually a pretty good sign to you or somebody that you may be talking to that they are heading towards burnout, is because instead of saying an emotion word like, oh, I'm feeling so anxious today, or that conversation made me angry, or I'm just kind of having the blues today, I'm feeling kind of sad, somebody is saying, I'm overwhelmed, I'm just feeling so overwhelmed. And that's because the actual brain is becoming overwhelmed. So that subconscious communication pattern from the subcortical limbic system forward has been cut. So the cognitive part of your brain is no longer getting that message about which feeling word you are experiencing. So then that part of self-care I talked about in coping, those subconscious things we do, shaking it out, taking a deep exhale, pacing back and forth, venting for a moment, talking to ourselves, those things we do all throughout the day to acknowledge and cope through emotions, those start to drop because your brain doesn't know which one to do because it doesn't know what emotion you are feeling. We want to remember self-care and coping are for our emotions, not necessarily what happened to us. So stressors are going to keep coming because that's life, but your ability to cope with the emotions caused by them is going to continue to drop when we don't have that moment to pause and instill that resiliency back in our brain. So stressors mount, coping drops, and then just bam, whatever that next event is that completely eclipses your ability to cope with the stressors that are coming will put you into that state of burnout. I can remember a few months ago, it happened to me one day. I had had a lot of anxiety going on just with stuff in my personal life that I was not really dealing with, not really coping with. And I was trying to get out the door and I dropped a cup of water, a cup, not even a glass, and it was water. Nothing broke, water spilled, not even on carpet, on hard floor. And I was done. I was done. I mean, it was my precipitating event. I think I had to like call Lavandra and be like, I can't go to the event I was going to. Like, I was just completely in that state of burnout, and I knew I needed to take a pause because I had not been doing my self care, and now I was burned out. And thankfully, we do work for an agency where that is acknowledged, and it was fine. I took time to really talk it through with myself, debrief with some trusted people, figure out what I'd been feeling, and put in my good coping mechanisms and help me get out of that burnout. But that's why I stress to remember that it's about the emotions, not what happened. I didn't need to figure out how to cope with dropping a cup of water. I needed to cope with what was going on with me. Now, we want to remember this burnout state, a crisis state, is our fight or flight response, and we will naturally come out of that state of brain functioning in about a day, maybe 2 days at most. Um, our brain will be so craving the balance by that point that we get to where we are exiting out of fight or flight mode that it will want to default to just those quick grab feel good neurotransmitters, again, that are easily accessible but won't bring actual balance. So super important that you kind of have a list. You know what your self-care activities are so that when you've reached that point of exhaustion coming out of fight or flight, you know what to do to take care of yourself. It can be kind of confusing to think about how just everyday stress can bring about a fight or flight response, burnout, crisis states. And it's because of what that toxic stress does, that predominant cortisol release. It is called toxic stress because it actually causes a diminishing in blood volume, um, atrophy, if you will, in the part of our brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. So the anterior cingulate cortex is in charge of using your sensory information, what you see, hear, smell, touch, etc., to activate fight or flight. So typically, because you would sense an immediate threat to your body, your brain would put on fight or flight because it's like, we don't have time for the fancy thinking. We just need to preserve the body. It gets you down to the nucleus of your thinking, your sympathetic nervous system. And then once your sensory information tells you that you have defeated or are now away from the danger, it will turn your fight or flight response off. So when that toxic stress crosses your blood-brain barrier and it causes this diminution in blood volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, your anterior cingulate cortex will stop putting you into fight or flight mode based upon your sensory information, and it will begin to put you into fight or flight mode based upon learned information and past information. So for anybody who has had any maybe past trauma, past dangerous experiences, your brain has that to default to put you into fight or flight. And then as I'm about to review, living in the media age that we do, we have constant access to learned danger and learned trauma for our brain to default to. And then of course, working in an agency like VLink, you have constant access to vicarious trauma, to other people's stories, other people's stress for your brain to default to put you into fight or flight. So working in this kind of help giving profession just gives you more of a tendency for burnout because your brain has so much information to default to when this stress occurs. Now, this is not permanent. The relaxation and the coping, getting that blood volume restored, that happens from balancing your neurotransmitters in a sustainable, longer term way with the things like positive interactions, resiliency that can come from having a support system, venting it out. I cannot stress how important venting is. Moving your body in ways that signal safety, breathing, all of these things are super, super important. And again, most of all, those active listening skills, even doing it to yourself, identifying what emotion word you've been feeling and using your coping mechanisms for that emotion. Whatever works for you, it is different for everyone. So, with the media consumption, and that includes social media, they've been doing more and more studies on this, especially ever since the pandemic. Because we do, like I mentioned before, live in a day and age with less chance of immediate threat or dangers to our bodies than ever before in human history, but we have higher rates of fear and anxiety and crisis moments as human beings. And many studies believe this is caused by our constant media and social media consumption. I had someone ask me this question, and it was the perfect example where they said, what do you mean that we live with less immediate threats to our bodies? We know about gun violence and how common that is. And I was like, that is the perfect example. That is learned danger, learned anxiety, because you are aware of the potential for gun violence. An immediate threat to your body would mean that someone is in front of you and you sense it with your sight, with your sound, that there is a weapon pointed at you. So that would be the difference there. So because we are constantly exposed to violence, danger, death, and conflict through the media, and then double that down with social media, which causes extra stress because of conflicting stories, and then the comments section, our anxieties are constantly just being raised by what we're consuming, which is putting human beings into these fight or flight modes, these crisis states more than ever before. So to talk for just a second, because I know I mentioned the fight or flight mode being the sympathetic nervous system, just going to talk about our sympathetic nervous system versus our parasympathetic nervous system and what that means. So the sympathetic nervous system is your body's fight or flight response. Now remember, traditionally when we're thinking of fight or flight, because your sensory information told you there's a danger, we do literally fight to defeat it or flight to run away. What we know now is because we can go into this mode based upon not having an immediate threat to our body, is that we have far more responses than that, than the fight, flight, or freeze than we originally just thought before, where we now know there is fight, flight, freeze, flop, and fawn. Um, and these do not always look like I am actually like physically fighting you or running away. These things can look like burnout, like I can't do my tasks. Like I'm just not going to be able to do it. I can't do my work. I can't concentrate. I can't pay attention to anything. Those can be flight and freeze responses. Fight responses being that you find yourself more agitated, maybe with the people that you're helping or your coworkers, and you have a harder time regulating that. Fawn responses even can be where you are being overly eager to please. And flop is actually like quite a literal response, a physical response where your body will just flop. It can't go on anymore. So again, remember your fight or flight response is your burnout. So, our sympathetic nervous system is countered by our parasympathetic nervous system. Our parasympathetic nervous system is when we have access to our full brain. Parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for things like sleep and digestion and other activities when the body is at rest. It's how you can tell when you have an influx of stress and maybe you're in that burnout state that things like your digestion and your appetite and your sleep is all dysregulated. That's because that parasympathetic nervous system is not getting electricity. And the way that our brain works is that it maintains homeostasis by either having one system active or the other. You're either in fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system dominance, where you do not have electricity to your parasympathetic nervous system, or you're not. So that's why so many skills in de-escalation or even self-soothing involve things like venting it out, because the language section of our brain is in our parasympathetic nervous system. So when you have to try and find the words that you want to use to express, that turns on a light switch in your parasympathetic nervous system, which would turn off your sympathetic nervous system. So that's what a lot of self-care is really about, is because it's about helping to make sure you're activating the part of your brain that can feel safe to eat. And humans have evolved now to where we can be in this prolonged state of fight or flight dominance, sympathetic nervous system dominance. By design, when we traditionally think of fight or flight, it's supposed to be used only in spurts, that kind of 20-minute marker of cortisol dominance. And then post that is when that becomes toxic stress. And remembering that when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, because we have had that overwhelming amount of stress, not because of our sensory information, there's nothing to tell the brain to turn off fight or flight response. If my fight or flight response was turned on because my sensory information smelled smoke in a building and I ran out, and then my sensory information told me I was away from the smoke and I was safe, that then tells my brain to turn off fight or flight response, turn back on my parasympathetic nervous system. When, because of just everyday stress that's compounded and my sympathetic nervous system is activated because of my cortisol release, not because there is a sensory danger, there's nothing to tell it to turn off. So that's why these things like the self-care and the naming our emotions and knowing some grounding and breathing techniques are so important, because that's what will tell our brain that we are safe and we do not need the sympathetic nervous system on. Remembering that when we do get to a point where maybe we are escalated, something feeling like a panic, feeling completely overwhelmed by our emotions, that's because that fight or flight response causes us to be purely focused on the external, because the brain is searching, searching, searching for where is this danger so that I can defeat it or get away from it and turn fight or flight response off. So when this has been caused because of stress, not because of a danger to our bodies, the brain is still solely focused on the outside trying to find the danger, because it's just knowing we're in fight or flight response. So you can't focus as much on internal regulation. That part of your brain's not getting electricity. So knowing how to recognize these signs and having that kind of go-to list of self-care activities or de-escalation activities for yourself is super important, because you won't just be able to rely on your own internal regulation in those times. So what we need to do is relaxation. Intentional, deliberate self-care is important more now than ever. Relaxation, the breathing, oxygenating the brain will undo the atrophy, undo the diminution blood volume to the anterior cingulate cortex. So you need to practice things like mindfulness and introspection to identify what emotions are being caused by the stresses in your life. And you want to remember that all emotions are good. sometimes we can kind of have this misunderstanding, like, happiness is a good emotion, but like anger, sadness, or bad emotions, they are all good. They're caused down in the part of our brain we do not have control over. You do not get to choose what emotions you have. We do get to choose how we behave in reaction to those emotions and what thoughts we attach to those emotions. But we do not get to choose the emotion. And shoving it down does not stop it, it just causes more stress. So, our power is that we need to lean in to whatever emotion we are feeling and find the best way for us to cope through it in adaptive ways that bring that longer term balance of our neurotransmitters to our brain. So, make the time for self care and know what works for you in specific situations. And knowing that relaxation, grounding can help you to exit this burnout state, this crisis state adaptively, and that's what also builds the resilience back in your brain to prevent the next stressor from putting you right back into a burnout. So, internal cues. Our brain not only interprets its fight or flight response from the external cues that we send it, or just because of the stress in our brain, it can also be from the internal cues that we send it that can be caused by stress. So let's say, you're having a long day, a long shift, and you've been holding tension in your wrists or in your neck all day. Traditionally speaking, we hold tension in our body like that because of fear or because of a need to stand completely still because of an enemy. So, holding that tension in your body, your brain will send that as danger cues, meaning that if that goes on for too long, you might need fight or flight on. The same can be said for having a very rapid heart rate. Or not getting your breathing regulated, that's going to send fear signals to your brain that it needs that fight or flight response on. So if your pulse is up, your heart rate is up because you're anxious or you're angry all day and you don't have that time to balance it out, bring it back down, that's going to be the same thing. Breathing with a lack of exhalations. When we're frustrated all day, we tend to just only inhale, and by design, our bodies will inhale so we don't pass out, which is lovely. But we only have time for deep exhales when we feel safe. So even just taking the time in a day to recognize that you've been holding tension or that you're anxious or angry or whatever it might be, and to exhale, that right there is going to send the safety signals to your brain so it stops releasing so much cortisol. So, movement and breathing can send the cues to our brain that we don't need that cortisol release. So, a few things that you can do. One, like I mentioned, focus on your exhales. You want to make sure that your exhale, when you're focusing on your breathing to give calm to your brain, that your exhale is longer than your inhale. That communicates safety. We only have time to exhale like that when we are feeling safe. You can also take that up a notch by doing what is called vooing, which would mean you would breathe in and instead of just breathing out, you would voo it. So I'll demonstrate that. You would go voo. And I know it seems silly, but what that does is when you va in that deep exhale, it vibrates the part of your chest right here, right beneath your cortisol, right beneath your collarbones, which actually activates your parasympathetic nervous system. Scanning for tension in your body, just taking a moment throughout the day, especially if you've had to be like in front of your computer all day or in your car all day, and like wiggling it out. Where is your tension? My wrist just cracked. Where is your tension? Is it in your wrist? Is it in your neck? Is it in your hips? Just wiggle it all out as you can. It's really good for your body. There's even a few different movements that you can do, visualizations. One could be chopping the tension. So, like if there is, you can visualize what's causing your stress, causing your anxiety, even causing your frustration. You picture it in front of you and you hold an imaginary axe above your head and you purposely tense up your body holding that axe. And then you chop it, which causes the release in the tension. So when you do that, hold it, tense, and then first you're exhaling. You're getting that deep exhale, you're visualizing chopping through that tension. And then when you purposely hold your stress, tension in your body and then release it, it helps to make sure your body actually loosens up. It can be the same thing with thinking of dropping the stress. You visualize holding it over your head, purposely tense up your arms and your shoulders, and then you drop it. Same thing. Grounding can be really, really helpful, especially if you're finding yourself overly anxious. Ones we can always do for ourselves is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where get yourself in kind of an enclosed space or a space where you can be alone. Of course, you can do this with somebody else. And you're going to name 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And you can switch up the senses, or of course, only use the senses that are available to you. But why this works, and you want to use all of the sensory information that you have available to you, is because remember that your brain has put you into fight or flight mode, not based on your sensory information. So when you force the brain to acknowledge all of your available senses and your immediate surroundings, you force it to acknowledge safety, physical safety, and it will know, oh, I don't need fight or flight mode on, and it will turn off. Debrief is extremely important. Getting the gunk out, getting that in a safe space where someone is listening to you, not just asking you a bunch of questions. You get to get out what you really need to. And you can even take that up a notch by, again, activating the space below your clavicle, tapping your fingers on it, and just saying what you need to someone, and they just repeat it right back to you. So if I was saying this to somebody, I'm tapping right here, they're tapping right here too. And I just say, I'm having a really hard day. And they say, you're having a really hard day. And I say, I'm feeling really stressed about these projects. And they say, you're feeling really stressed about these projects. It sounds silly, but when our brain is really overwhelmed and we're craving that human connection, part of that resiliency, having someone just say back to you communicates to your brain that they really heard you and gets you that calming connection, which helps to balance out your stress hormones. And again, tapping right here helps to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. A few other examples, again, the deep exhales, the boos, grounding with the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, debrief with the tapping, a neck release, purposeful neck release, where you want to go back, 1, 2, ear on the right shoulder, chin to chest, ear on the left shoulder, back. And you do that big circle a few times in one direction and then back in the other direction, taking it slow, making sure you're hitting those points. Shoulder release, that can be really helpful. Again, of course, you can always just, circle them around. You can also do what is called breaking the chains, which can help you to release tension and release your shoulders. Breaking the chains would be that you hold your arms one on top of the other like this, purposefully tense them up, put that tension in your arms and your shoulders, and then go break the chain, pull your wrists to your hips. And that helps to release your shoulders. What you can also do to help release your hips, of course, just stand up, wiggle them out. We hold a lot of stress in our hips. But what you can also do is plant your feet on the floor in the chair that you are sitting in, put your hands next to your hips, and then move in a circle. This is called the Sufi grind. Do it in a big circle a couple times in one direction, and then do it the other way. You want to be able to feel this rotation and the movement all in your sit bones. And that is going to help to release tension in your hips, and it's also grounding. And then you can also do the wood chopper, which is what I showed you before, where you're holding the axe and you're chopping through the stress. There's all kinds of great exercise examples you can look up, but the biggest one, take some breaths, make sure you're grounded, and wiggle out the tension in your body where you are experiencing it. So we want to remember when it comes to self-care, those are those kind of more what we just reviewed, things we can do throughout our day, those subconscious movements, but we also need to be sure that we are doing deliberate self-care throughout our week to help prevent burnout, or again, when you need to take that pause and heal yourself from burnout. One is look at what you're consuming. Look at your media consumption and your social media consumption. There can be a lot of pressure to stay informed. We have a great podcast episode about it on Real Talk with guest Aaron Sims. So please look that up on our Spotify and YouTube channel at VLink Inc. Kind of finding that balance on staying informed versus taking care of your own self-care, however that might look at. And that's going to be different for different people. But no, again, oxygen mask theory, you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of other people. So monitor, is your amount of staying informed, is your amount of media consumption causing you too much stress? Because then it doesn't matter how well informed you are, you're not going to be able to act on it in ways because your brain's going to be overwhelmed. See if you can find even different news sites where you can digest that media from. Maybe get those bullet points. Is there a trusted friend or colleague for when you just can't do it yourself that can kind of just give you the bites of what you need? And then looking at your social media feed, look at what stresses you out and what doesn't. I've had times where I've just had to take the apps off my phone. Specifically, I know during the midst of the pandemic, I definitely had to deactivate social media off my phone. I didn't deactivate my accounts, I just took it off my phone. Look at just where you're at. Is this I'm positive, distracting myself, giving myself a little dopamine, or am I doom scrolling? And try and find the balance. And then also remember the power of the unfollow or the block, even so that you're not getting that content on your feed that might cause you stress. I really try and tailor mine so that I basically like only have things popping up on my feed that are like babies, fat hippos, dog memes, and food. And that's the way I like it, So find what works for you. Making sure you can find your way to leave work at work. And that can be, again, even more difficult. We work at ViaLink. We do not have normal office hours. And again, we've got our phones. We have constant access to our work. So it's the responsibility of your supervisors to make sure that you have that compartmentalization, a way to leave work at work, and on yourself. Um, so again, making sure that you've got that dialogue with managers and supervisors of like, when I'm off work, I'm off work. These are the hours I'm not responsible for checking my emails, things like that. And then doing things for yourself. Our brain craves for us to be able to tell it what part of the day we're focusing on. Even if we're moving from work stress to personal life stress, it wants that signal. So something even like changing your clothes when you're done with work. Like right now, full disclosure, I am still in my pajamas. I am in the sweatshirt and shorts that I slept in. Um, but I will work in that. And then when my work is done, I will change into a different sweatshirt and pajama shorts because that is good for my brain. It signals to my brain that I am transitioning to a different part of my day. Really important, especially if you work from home, to give your brain those signals. Make sure you have a specific work area and that you shut it down or leave it when work is done. I always make sure to put my laptop away when my workday is done to help signal that to my brain, or do an activity when work is done. Go for a walk, cook dinner, call a friend or a family member, anything like that. Make sure you just send a signal to your brain about what part of the day you're focusing on. Making sure you're deliberately naming your emotions and coping mechanisms that work for you for those emotions. And remembering that is different for different people, and you're coping with the emotion, not necessarily with what happened to you. Remember the water cup. Get outside. And y'all, I never thought I'd be this person. I was never a huge outside girly before, but it is so important for us to get outside, to get fresh oxygen, even if it's dumpster air oxygen. It's really important for us and for our brain to not just have that kind of recirculated air. And then when we go outside, we are flooded with sensory information, what we're hearing, smelling, etc. And that helps to balance the body. And literally, even the stuff, if you have access to it, and again, I never thought I'd be this person, touching nature, touching a tree, putting your feet in the dirt, it's scientifically proven. It really does balance out the chemicals in our brain. So, really, really important to be able to get outside when you can. Knowing how to relax your body, stop sending those danger signals to your brain, whatever works for you, meditation, breathing, relaxation, grounding. And like it is what works for you. Like I am not great at meditating, which I know is controversial since I work in mental health, but meditating absolutely does not work for me when I am anxious. That does not help soothe anxiety for me. So it's not what I do, but it works for a lot of other people. So knowing what works best for you. And then ask for help. There is support out there to address the things like stress and burnout, or even if we're getting into more mental health struggles like suicide ideation, trauma, panic attacks, there is help. And we do work for an agency that wants to help you. And remember that that kind of acute stress can end, but that doesn't mean that the effects of the burnout are just going to immediately go away. You have to take the time to take care of yourself. Oh no, my computer's freezing. Okay, I think we're good now. Here we go. Sorry about that. I recommend making a self-care checklist. That way you have it as a go-to when your brain might be overwhelmed and it's not as easy for you to remember what type of self-care works for specific emotions. So what works for you with anger? Now, again, this can be different for different people. Things like boxing, a dance party, yelling, throwing ice, things that are safe for your body and they help you to kind of get out that anger. Now, again, that's not the same for everybody. I actually, when I'm angry, have to be slower. When I'm angry, that is actually when something more like meditation or yoga works well for me, but that's for me. So find what works best for you. For feeling sad, what works for you? A longer shower, cooking, watching a movie. And remember that it's okay to distract yourself once you've acknowledged an emotion. That is still acknowledging the emotion. Um, and sadness is different for different people. Like my default response to pretty much any emotion is to start crying. So I don't need when I'm feeling sad to kind of like lean into that to get the tears going. I do better with kind of distracting myself, getting something that makes me laugh. That helps me deal through feeling sad. Other people, maybe it's harder to lean into that sadness or get the tears coming if that's what they need. So you might watch a sadder movie or listen to songs that kind of help get you in your feels, whatever works for you. Longer showers, cooking, whatever that might be. Anxiety, things like yoga, running, a podcast, venting, getting that meet up with that support or a phone call. And again, different for different people. A lot of people for anxiety, that's when being slower, the mindfulness, the meditation works better. For me personally with anxiety, I have to be more frenetic. Like I basically know I have to pace for a very long time and vent to someone who is a very good listener. And that's what helps me with anxiety. And then overwhelmed. If we're getting to that point where we're overwhelmed, we know it's the point where we're burned out. We need to speak with someone that we trust. We need to figure out what emotions we've been tamping down, getting a longer walk outside and taking a pause. Taking a pause for some deliberate self care is very needed. So, again, have these listed so that you can have them to reference whenever maybe you're feeling tired from your day. We want to remember that none of us can be superhuman. All of you are superheroes. You do superhero work, but we all have very human brains, and human brains need the time for relaxation. And just the truth of it is, human brains will have burnout, and that's okay because we can heal ourselves from it and we can build back that resiliency. So remember that we can feel better, and also for us to continue to check in on the wellness of our fellow superheroes. We do have a responsibility to each other. So if you are noticing something in a coworker and you want to check in on them, do so. People like to feel seen, but make sure we do it in a constructive way. Don't just ever go up to somebody and be like, hey, are you okay? If you've ever had that done to you, it's really off-putting. But if you start with something observable, that really helps. So if you're able to say, like, hey, I know we haven't been able to chat on our breaks lately. Are you doing okay? Or hey, I know I haven't seen you at the office, wellness activities. Is everything all right? That's something observable, not judgmental. You're not saying everything about you looks wrong. And it gives that person a specific observable thing that they can answer to you. It can also be for that person a permission to broadening the conversation or to just keeping it right there. If maybe you're not the person that they feel comfortable talking to, but everybody feels better knowing that they are seen and that people care about them. So let's reduce the stigma. Let's not think that we all just power through and pummel through. That's not how brains work. And let's take care of each other, keep ourselves accountable, and know that it's okay when we're not okay. I think being in help giving roles, working for agencies like ViaLink, there can be a lot of pressure that you always have to be okay. Likely in your personal life, you're someone that people often go to for help and support. And I know there's a lot of like wonderful messages, but they can put pressure on you from friends and family that are like, oh my gosh, what you do is so important. Your job is so important. So it makes you feel like you can't kind of vent about your work stress like people in other careers can. No, you still get to vent. You get to vent. You get to be stressed. You're a human being, and this is hard work. So it is okay to be frustrated with your job. You have earned that right. You have a very stressful job where you are helping a lot of people and you obviously really care. So know that it is okay and it doesn't make you ungrateful or not passionate to have those moments of frustration, and you deserve the support during those times. So that is most of all of what I had to share with y'all today. Again, I just stress you to take care of yourself. I thank you all for what you do. I'm so glad I get to work with so many superheroes. And let's just all please take care of ourselves and take care of each other. Thank you.